Hello, my name is Niki Ashton. I'm the MP for Churchill, Keewatinook Aski, and Deputy Critic for Indigenous and Northern Affairs with the NDP. And I'm proud to be standing here with my colleague, Lori Idlout, the MP for Nunavut and Critic for Northern and Indigenous Services. We are here to talk about how the inflation crisis is hitting Northern and Indigenous communities hard. Northern and Indigenous communities already faced a higher cost of living. But because of the inflation crisis, the situation has become even worse. We are here to call on the Liberals to step up and take action in support of Northern and Indigenous people. A few weeks ago, Red Sucker Lake First Nation in our constituency was in the news because a 15-year-old took his own life in his own schoolyard. The chief of Red Sucker Lake was clear that the mental health crisis in his community is deeply connected to the fact that people can barely afford food and basic necessities. We have heard many people reach out to our offices, on social media, in our communities, talk about the way in which they are struggling in a way that they haven't or didn't as much before. We must be clear that Canada doesn't just have an inequality crisis. Canada doesn't just have an inflation crisis. We have an inequality crisis. And nowhere is that more obvious than in Northern and Indigenous communities. Yesterday, I was up in Parliament talking about how corporate Canada is raking it in. Royal Bank is just taking over another bank. We know that Loblaws, one of the biggest supermarket chains in our country, has announced that their profits are up by 30%. We also know that the biggest corporations in our country haven't paid $30 billion in taxes that they should have normally paid. And the reality is that those profits are on the backs of people, working people, people on fixed incomes. It is time that we take action. We need to reform the Nutrition North program so funding goes directly to people, not big box stores. We need to make sure that we're lowering prices in the North by removing the GST on home heating and make targeted investments to subsidize fuel costs that are off the charts for essential transportation in Northern and Indigenous communities. Let's talk a bit about some of those prices. Shamattawa First Nation, $3.10 a litre for fuel. To Dooley Lake, $3.09 per litre. Poplar River First Nation, just around $3 a litre. Churchill, $2.60 a litre. War Lake, $2.56 a litre. York Landing, $2.35 a litre. Here I have a picture of a gas receipt from Pucketawagan First Nation, where a litre of gas is at $2.89. People cannot afford to live with these prices. People have also reached out about the crisis level when it comes to basic foods. Here we have from Cross Lake, pork side ribs, $24.34. And if we look at some of the prices compared to, say, Ottawa, you'd find the same for about $9.46. Another picture from Cross Lake. We have chicken breasts, $28.96. Here in Ottawa, you might find it for $12 or even $10. We have frozen pizzas, something that so many families rely on. In Shamattawa, over $12 a box. Here in Ottawa, you'd find that for $5.88. And here, in so many communities where clean drinking water is not available, we have 1 liter bottle of water in Shamattawa First Nation for $7.09. Here in Ottawa, a 4-liter bottle of clean drinking water is sold for $1.99. I would now like to pass the mic on to my colleague, Lori Idlout, to share the very difficult reality in her part of the country as well.
MP Niki Ashton, and I share the same sentiments about the great work that you as my colleague do, and it is an honor to share this release with you about the concerns of inflation that has existed in our territories for much longer than what we've been seeing in Canada currently. I completely and wholeheartedly agree that the Nutrition North program needs to have an overhaul. For example, Northmart took in over 157 million in net earnings, an increase of 9.7% from 2020. The Northmart president and CEO received over 5 million in compensation for 2021. On top of the nearly 2.7 million in compensation they received in 2020. Now, for me to talk about the Nutrition North program, which to me is a subsidy for the Northmart and other for-profit corporations. In 2022 and 2023, the retail subsidy has a budget of 131.3 million. This budget increases by roughly 5% each year in an attempt to keep pace with population, growth, inflation, and the high cost of operating in isolated northern communities. An additional 36 million will be spent, we're told, on the Harvesters Support Program, which when I've heard from Nunavut about this program, they didn't even know existed. For this program, we are going to need to see improvements. I wanted to do the same thing that my colleague Niki has done and share some food prices that exist in Nunavut. For example, Campbell's soup, which is not in here, the Frito-Lay pack, which is $33.69 in Nunavut. In Ottawa, is $10.99. A pack of tomatoes in the same photo, which has 4 tomatoes in one bag, is $8.19 versus $1.77 in Ottawa. For apples per kilogram in Nunavut is $6.39 versus $5.49 in Ottawa. And finally, a canned tuna is $9.79 in Nunavut versus $2.29 in Ottawa. One of the stories that I wanted to share very quickly from my visit to Arviat earlier this year that was quite compelling was from a hunter named Peter Alarak, who told me that Nutrition North needs to improve because it's not working the way it is. And he said, if it were to improve, here is how it could be expressed. Sorry, I'm finding. He said to me, one bullet could provide for 200 to 300 pounds of meat. If this program were to better support individuals, more families would be fed. Unfortunately, that is not what is happening. I will give it back to Niki for some more information.
Thank you, Lori. I think we can all agree that the numbers that you've heard today are shocking and unacceptable. But unfortunately, they are the reality in many of the communities we represent, in many Indigenous and Northern communities across our country. And this demands federal action. We cannot pretend that doing nothing when it comes to corporate profiteering is actually a solution. People in Northern and Indigenous communities, and yes, across the country, are suffering. We need to make sure that the richest among us are paying their fair share so that we can reinvest that money into communities. But we also need the federal government, the Liberals, to take targeted action to support Northern and Indigenous communities. And I want to reiterate, we've heard a lot about the profits that big companies are making these days. In 2021, Northmart took in over $157 million in net earnings, an increase of 9.7% from 2020. The Northmart president and CEO, as Lori mentioned, and I'll just reiterate, received over $5 million in compensation for 2021, on top of the nearly $2.7 million in compensation they received in 2020. All this while Northern families cannot afford the groceries they need. I also want to acknowledge that, for many communities, bringing in food on their own is something that's increasingly difficult given the high cost of fuel, the high transportation costs as well. We need to make sure that the Nutrition North program is being reviewed and is reformed given the inflation crisis impacts on Northern and Indigenous communities. And I'll turn to my colleague Lori to talk about the cost of fuel.
Niki, on the cost of fuel, there are almost 300 First Nations, Inuit, Métis, living in remote communities that solely rely on diesel power. Nunavut's power needs are almost entirely met through diesel, which must be delivered in bulk into the community by sea lift. The average price of diesel right now is 202.1 cents per liter, up nearly 66 cents per liter compared to last year.
And while today we focused on the cost of food and basic necessities, on home heating fuel, and the need to take action around the cost of fuel for essential needs in Northern and Indigenous communities, we can't talk about the inflation crisis and the inequality crisis without talking about the housing crisis in Northern and Indigenous communities. And we in the NDP have been very clear that the Liberals need to move on commitments around Indigenous housing in dealing with the absolute housing crisis in so many of our communities. We also know that rising construction costs threaten housing projects across northern, rural and remote Canada. We know that Nunavut has had to cancel many housing and infrastructure proposals because they simply cannot afford to build them. In our constituency, Pimicikamak Cree Nation, Cross Lake in northern Manitoba, has been very clear it needs approximately 1,000 homes to meet the needs in its community. Every single First Nation that I represent is facing a housing crisis. We need to make sure that the rising costs of building supplies, which we've seen across the country, is not used as an excuse to move on dealing with the housing crisis, the long-standing housing crisis in Indigenous and Northern communities. We need to make sure that the federal government understands the extent to which Northern and Indigenous communities are in crisis at this time, on various fronts. And that is why today we are here calling on the Liberals to act, to take targeted action in support of the needs of Northern and Indigenous communities when it comes to food security and reviewing and reforming the Nutrition North program, when it comes to removing the GST off of home heating fuel, but taking also targeted action around fuel that's used for essential purposes in our communities. Northern and Indigenous communities, Northern and Indigenous peoples cannot afford to keep going down this path. We need Canada to act.